When my husband turned our children into torture machines, I swore his experiment would have an unexpected end. That sentence sits in my mouth like a bitter seed I have swallowed and learned to live with for years. I say it now with my hands smelling of damp earth and chamomile, the sun warming the back of my neck, because the truth deserves to be spoken plain. I will not hide behind pretty phrases. I am Edith May Gunderson, 78 years young, as I like to tell the neighbors, and I tend an herb garden behind a small blue house that looks as harmless as a storybook. I bake apple pies on Sundays. I feed 3 lazy cats. I smile at grandchildren who come in from Bozeman, and I make tea for the ladies from St. Michael's. They call me the herb grandma and they mean it kindly. They do not know what those hands have done. You might think a woman like me, white hair, slow smile, gentle voice on an afternoon live stream, could never contain a story like mine. Maybe that's why I keep telling it. Each like, each comment, each sympathetic "Oh Edith," is a small lamp I set along the path so others might follow if they must. I tell this because once long ago I learned something I think is true. Nobody pokes the bear and gets away with it. Not if that bear is a mother. I was born in 1947 in a cabin near Yellowstone. We were a poor, honest cluster of people who understood the cost of cold nights and hard winters. My mother Irene taught me how to grind herbs in a wooden mortar, and how to read the signs the land offers if you slow down enough to listen. My father, George, was a trapper with hands that could mend a broken fence and also gut a deer with such efficiency you'd think you were watching the kind of choreography that belongs in nature, not in a kitchen. I learned mercy in the same breath I learned survival. I learned that some plants heal and some plants hold secrets. And I learned, later than I should have, that people can hide sick things behind books, behind credentials, behind a smile that smells of city soap. He arrived on a Sunday afternoon potluck, Everett Maxwell. Big city, better clothes, round glasses that made his eyes look like study lenses. He said he was a scientist. He said he wanted to study herbs. He flattered my mama, he gave my brothers fishing hooks. He told me I had exceptional genetics like I was a prize hog at a county fair. My parents were dazzled by the attention. I was 12 and invisible enough to be studied and noticed at once. He came often. He taught me to read books that made my head swell with wonder. For a while I believed him. He made me think that the world outside our settlement might have room for a country girl with steady hands. He promised the city, a school in Denver, a future. On my 15th birthday, he delivered that promise. Not to a school but to a house in the woods where education meant measurements and measurements meant power. At 17 I had a wedding that wasn't really mine. The papers were signed, the photographs were taken. The neighbors called me Mrs. Maxwell with hesitant respect while my stomach folded itself into a cold, secret knot. He was 42 and he smelled of books and whiskey and something clinical like the inside of a hospital. He taught disciplines at Cornell, he said, until men with small minds called his methods too advanced. He believed rules were for the average. He believed experimentation was truth. He made his laboratory in our home. He made me the subject and our children the instruments. It began small, sleep deprivation, cold stretches, withholding words, and then it became monstrous. He trained the children to hurt me on command. Owen, 6 and bright, was told he would learn to apply a controlled painful stimulus. Jeremy, Zelda, Catherine. They learned the names of pressure points and how contortions of a mother's face change under different conditions. Everett took notes in black notebooks that smelled of ink and obsession. He photographed bruises as if they were species for classification. You can imagine the small things. A chair placed, a timer set, a device that made faint shocks that look harmless when you are told it is for science. You might not be able to imagine the terrible bigger things. How a child's eyes can go flat the way river stones do after years in the water. How a mother can count the time between the child's breath and her own tears. How a man with round glasses can write subject A and mean his own wife. The worst of it was not the pain itself at first. Any pain can be survived if you know it's finite. The worst was the way Everett taught the children to become what he wanted. Precise, detached, obedient. He made them instruments not of malice but of necessity. If you refused, he said, you'd be punished. He would make you watch another sibling punished. He would take away food. He would lock you in the basement. For 15 years we lived as though the world had turned glass and only his voice could make the shapes inside move. I was a mother stripped clean and offered up to his charts and graphs. He measured my cries, the dilation of my pupils, the subtle electrical changes in my skin when a child pulled my hair. He would murmur, fascinated. Fascinating how the human body adapts. In the dark of those nights I did things that would terrify the neat men with pens. I learned patience, not like the patience of prayer but the patience of someone learning to dismantle a clock by touch. I learned when Everett rose what he ate, how many sips of whiskey he took before bed. I learned the secret compartment in his desk where he kept his keys. I learned the private road that led to our property, and I learned the times he would be gone long enough that the house would be unguarded. My anger changed shape. At first it was a hot, useless thing that made me scream and break things. Those attempts fed him. He called them data points and wrote them down with a pencil in the corner of a page labeled, aggression response. So I learned to cool it down. I learned to sit like a patient animal and watch him like a scientist who had finally realized he was being observed. When Owen reached 12, something shifted. He looked at me one night with an intelligence that was both his and an older thing's. He slipped into my room, a flashlight half hidden under his shirt. The house smelled of wood smoke and disinfectant. He whispered, "What we're doing. It's wrong, isn't it?" My heart nearly stopped. I had been planting the same question in him for months with touches and whispers, and the look of a mother who would risk anything. Now the dam broke, small and human. He said, "We could run. We could tell. I could find keys. I could. And we will," I said, but I felt the words shiver. But running is only one thing. He will find us. He will find someone else. No. This must stop here. So we read the notebooks. Oh, the notebooks. Do you know what it feels like to see your life rendered into paper? Each session, each humiliation described like a weather log. His handwriting was neat and cruel. There were photographs and tables and an index. He called me Subject A. My children were variously numbered. There were more than 50 volumes, stretching across years like a record of winter after winter. I remember the way my finger trembled over the spine of one book labeled, in his tidy script, Extreme Reactions, Subject A. As we read, the cold plan in me started to thaw into something fierce and whole. Escape would be the first act but not the last. I thought of my mother's mortar, the herb she taught me to use to ease fevers and to soothe bruises. I thought of the plants that could confuse a man's digestion, that could make sleep come like a gentle hand, that could make a proud man see the world as a stranger. I did not want to hurt my children. I wanted to make a man who could catalog pain understand what it means to be cataloged. I taught Owen about the world beyond the trees. Denver police courtrooms. He was terrified of the law because he'd never seen it. He was terrified of his father because the father was a god in his mind, or had been until he was not. Over months we practiced small acts. How to take a key from a pocket without being seen. How to fold a page out of a notebook so you only remove the necessary evidence and not the whole stack. We made lists in our heads of what must be taken and what could be left. Everett announced a 3-day trip to Denver to buy equipment. A window as wide as a summer sky. On the night he left we opened his office and saw more notebooks than a library. We could not carry them all. We chose the ones that contained the worst of his methods, the ones with the photographs and the sections that spoke of the children as instruments. Owen and I lit a candle and read by its flicker, and the fury I had disciplined for years came roaring back, but this time I tamed it and set it to work. I began to plant in secret. Not just chamomile and lavender for soothing the neighbors, but other things my mother mentioned in half-spoken sentences. Plants that could dull the senses, plants that could make a man nauseous for a day, plants that could unbalance the steady mind. I planted them away from prying eyes in corners of the land Everett never walked, behind the old oak where the kids once hung a tire swing. I learned how to dry, how to make a tincture, how to make a tea that smells like nothing more than comfort, and yet holds a single precise possibility. People might judge me when they hear this. They will call it trickery or witchcraft or the folly of an old woman. But there is a difference between poison and prudence. I am not reckless. I am not cruel for cruelty's sake. I learned cruelty from a man who called it science. On the eve of his return, as I buried a small root beneath the soil and smoothed the earth with the heel of my hand, Owen watched me with eyes that had been through too much. "Are you sure, Mom?" he asked. I looked at his face, so young, so old, and answered with the only thing I could trust. "I am certain. We will take his notebooks, we will run, and then we will make sure he never hurts anyone again. He will understand what he has been making us feel." He swallowed and hugged my waist like a child who still wanted to be carried. I let him. Later, when he slept, I sat on the back steps and listened to the creek remember its old songs. The stars were sharp and cold. I thought of the notebook stacked like a confession. I thought of the experiments he would run on me had he remained free. I thought of the way a man like him believed himself untouchable because he had numbers on his side. I was not a scientist by training, but I had learned his language. I had learned variables and controls. I would not leave things to chance. I would design an experiment of my own, using his own rules against him: predictability, control, a single strong variable. He loved to control variables. I would give him a single variable he could not deny. The plan was more than escape. It was a calculus of revenge mixed with the desperate, murky ethics of a mother who had been ground down to a precise edge. If the law failed us, I would make the man who thought he could teach suffering taste his own medicine, measured and slow, the way he measured my tears. I tucked the last sprig into the soil and pressed my palm over it until the earth hummed under my skin. The garden smelled like promise and chamomile. In the house behind me, the black notebooks lay in a trunk, folded in a blanket. I could hear the evening wind comb through the trees like a soft, knowing hand. When he returned, he would find an empty house and a stack of proof. He would find that we had gone. But we would not leave without leaving him something to read that he would never forget. I stood from the sun-warmed soil and wiped my hands on my skirt. My cats brushed my ankles. I smiled, and the smile felt like the first honest thing I'd given myself in years. There was a coldness inside me now, shaped by fury and learning. There was a patience stitched through with purpose. I would end his experiment. I would end his paper empire. And I would make sure the world knew what he had done. But first we had to get out. And the herbs in my secret beds were the first small step in a plan that would take everything I had learned in 15 years to carry out. The creak of the porch sign swung in the evening air, "Welcome," and I thought of the welcome that awaited him. The precise, planned outcome of a study he could not control. The experiment would be over. The final variable would be applied. I pressed my nails into the earth once more as if to pin the thought there. "Tonight," I said softly into the dark, "the last page of his notebook will be written with his own hand." The night we left felt both impossibly small and gigantic at once, like folding a life into a letter. I remember the way the moon spilled silver over the gate, and how the air smelled of crushed mint and the faint, sweet rot that lives at the heart of any good orchard. Owen moved like a shadow that belonged to the house, silent, quick, and terribly determined. He carried the trunk with the chosen notebooks, wrapped in an old quilt that belonged to my mother. I carried the small satchel with the tinctures and dried roots, everything measured, everything labeled in my head as if I were still making a chart. Owen had learned the routes under Everett's absence. He had watched his father's rhythms and shifted like wind through grass. We moved through the dark like people who had rehearsed grief for years, and at last found the pattern of a step that could be changed. We did not wake the other children. Zelda slept with the thin, practiced calm of someone who has learned to fold misery into herself. Jeremy, small and stubborn, would have bolted if woken. Catherine was like a song that had been interrupted too soon. She would follow once she understood. We reached the gate without tripping the sensor. Everett was meticulous, but his sensors didn't sense a heart determined by a mother's will. The car we had borrowed from a merchant who owed my father a favor was an old station wagon with a heater that took a long time to remember it was alive. We loaded the trunk, the smallest set of books that would carry the weight of proof, the photographs, the dated journals with the sessions where the children were asked to use force, the section labeled Extreme Reactions Subject A. Each book was a piece of my life folded into paper. I tried not to think of the things those pages would show to people unused to such darkness. Names, exact dates, blue ink that described how my skin had gone gray once after enough shocks to make me pass out. I thought of how a jury might look at those graphs and not see the nights spent whispering to a frightened boy, or the small vitamin-thin meals that sustained us when he wanted to test hunger. But a jury could hold paper and say what a man had done. A jury could take numbers and turn them into a sentence. That was the hope we wrapped as carefully as we wrapped the notebooks. We drove until the headlights looked small and timid behind us. We stopped once in the middle of nowhere for tea. I made the tincture into a mild brew, not to hurt but to steady our hands. The herbs had a sleepy kindness, They made the world go soft at the edges. We were not trying to drug anyone into a stupor we could not control. I had learned the difference between a medicine and a trap. Everything I did was weighted with the thought of my children's futures. We arrived at Pinewood as the first thin strips of dawn lifted above the pines. I had arranged to meet Mrs. Hall, the woman who ran the post office and who had once traded for my mother's salve after her daughter's fever. She was on my side in the small, quiet way old friends take sides in the world. She put us in touch with a young lawyer who had a house full of law books and an eagerness that smelled like clean paper. I signed my name on more document forms than I could count, the ink heavier than any pen I'd held in Everett's house. I talked and there were ears that listened, and for the first time in a long while I was not talking to a man who took notes for his own purposes. Police came. Their uniforms had the awkward humility of people not used to small-town horrors. They took the notebooks carefully, as if handling the bones of something that might still wake up. They asked questions with patience I had not expected. I gave them my testimony. Owen, pale but steady, spoke about keys and schedules and how his father had left for Denver on this date. There were breaks in his voice. He is my child. And to hear his voice wobble with the weight of confession was both unbearable and merciful. The officers wrote down details and took photographs. There was a moment, standing in a fluorescent-lit room with pages spread like a map between my hands, when I thought perhaps the world had shifted a small inch in our favor. Perhaps the paper would speak and judges and juries would understand. The lawyer believed us. He said there was enough here for an arrest and that the notebooks were a document of crimes. That confidence warmed something in me. I allowed myself a small, dangerous spark of trust. We returned to the property not long after. At least that was the plan. The officers needed to see the place. They drove slow down the private road, boots on the ground, faces set like statues. Everett's house looked smaller than it had in my memory, like a thing that had been hollowed out to the point of being nearly invisible. The lab annex still sat there, the windows dark, the instruments that had once been used for perverse measurement now wrapped in dust. On the porch I felt a lightness I hadn't known in a decade. It was shallow and fragile and perfectly human. I walked through the rooms and could hardly believe these were the same spaces that had held years of my life like jars on a shelf. The officers took photos and dusted for prints, and one of them, a young man who had children of his own, put a hand on my shoulder and said, "We'll take it from here, Mrs. Gunderson." The arrest came 2 days later. Everett returned from Denver with suitcases and a face made of small, delicate rage. It was the look of a man who was used to being admired, and suddenly found himself being examined. They found him in his study, his black notebook spread like a terrible fan. He was compliant in a way that made my own skin crawl. He let them cuff him, he let them read him rights, and he let the papers be carried away. The courtroom later would record his voice reading a statement that sounded like a man reciting a script he had practiced in front of his mirror. He managed to look at me once in the lineup the way a scientist might look at a subject before the final test. "You will regret what will happen to my work," he murmured, as if he believed his notebooks were his children. He had always confused creation with ownership. My children waited at the doorway when he was taken away. Zelda stood like a statue, Riverstone calm. Jeremy was shaky but quietly furious. Catherine clung to Owen's sleeve as if it were an anchor. I put my arm around them and felt the slow, odd bloom of something like safety. The police told us the initial charges would stand, that there was enough for battery, for unlawful confinement, for abuse, and possibly for more as the investigation continued. It felt like a beginning of something on paper and a terrifying crack at the same time. But the law moves like a heavy, slow river. Weeks and months passed in a way that taught me how fragile hope can be. Everett hired a lawyer with a voice that sounded like a bell. He called witnesses from the corners of his academic world and painted himself as a misunderstood genius. He claimed consent, he claimed a twisted pedagogy, he claimed things that felt like filigree over a tomb. People who listened to him brought the same kind of polite, puzzled disbelief you give to a man telling a story that seems like fevered fiction. At home, the worst things did not disappear. The children had to relearn what it meant to be children. Zelda kept her distance even when I tried to hold her. She had been taught to be efficient. Jeremy needed anger like a bone to gnaw. Catherine needed lullabies and the small things that told a child the world was safe. Owen shouldered guilt like an old coat he could not shrug off. I tried to mend the fabric of our days, cooking, teaching. letting the cats be our small steady companions. I made salves and pies and pretended the oven's warmth could melt decades. The hearings were a strange theater. Everett sat like an accused deity, his skin pale and princely, and he watched the proceedings like a man observing a data set. The prosecution read from the notebooks. There were photographs, images of bruises, pages of clinical notes. The air in the courtroom sometimes felt too thin for the facts. People sniffled. There were accusations. He had lawyers who argued about the admissibility of evidence and the scientific merit of certain methods. Those words made me feel as if I were listening to the theft of language, the twisting of horror into a discipline. One afternoon during a recess, Zelda came to me and whispered, "Mother, what if they twist the truth? What if they turn it on us?" Her voice was small. She kept her hands folded like someone keeping a wound from drying out. I tightened my jaw and told her, "We keep going. Truth is a stubborn thing. Paper and witnesses can be cruelly slow, but they are stubborn. We just have to be more stubborn." And yet, the world was not only stubborn in justice but in chance. One small mistake can blow a life back into glass. I had spent years planning with the precise calculation of a man who loved graphs, but I had not planned for everything. I had not planned for how people resent a woman who takes her own hand and shapes a blade with it. I had not planned for the way neighbors whisper to each other when a family's skeletons spill into sunlight. I had not planned for the cost this would extract from my children when they sat in rooms and had strangers ask them to recount things they had buried. Then came the letter. We received it one evening while the children were working on a small garden patch, Zelda trying to coax a tomato plant to survive, Jeremy tossing a stone into the creek with the reckless aim of a boy angry at the world. I saw the envelope on the porch table, plain and official. The return address was a county facility I had heard of once, a place where men were sent when their crimes sat heavy in the world. I opened the letter with the same trembling hand I had years before when opening the trunk with the notebooks. The paper inside was stamped and bureaucratic. It said he was in a holding facility in Pinewood, and the jail had placed a medical hold pending psychiatric evaluation. That sounded on paper like success. The man who had kept us in a laboratory of cruelty was no longer on the street. But the letter went on. It included a line that made my breath stop cold and hard as a stone. There had been a request from an unnamed source for a protective transfer. The file did not name where he was to be sent or when. It only said that the case was sensitive, and that certain steps would be taken, in the interest of public safety and continuity of investigation. I read the sentence twice and then a third time. My scalp prickled. The unnamed request could be anything. It could be a legitimate safety protocol. It could be a bureaucrat's attempt to smooth things over. Or it could be a shield for the very power Everett had longed for. An invisible hand that might move him out of reach. I felt the old familiar cold rise in me again. The early years of learning that a man with a notebook could make the whole world tilt toward his version of truth. I remembered his voice when he said he'd one day show the world the value of his work. I remembered the man who loved control more than mercy. That night I sat with the letter between my fingers and watched the shadows move across the kitchen floor. Owen folded the mail slowly and said nothing. The children had gone to bed early. The house smelled like yeast and lavender. For the first time in months I felt a whisper of dread that was not about paper or trials but about the slippery movement of men who know how to hide. If he was to be moved out of reach, what then? What use were the notebooks if the man who had written them never faced the reading? Would the law care enough to track him across county lines? Would the judge sign orders that would lock him away where no court could find him? I thought of the plants in my garden. Their roots tangled underground where nobody's eye could see them. I thought of patience and patience's brother, which is persistence. I thought of the plan we had made at the edge of Everett's property, and how that plan was meant to be a lever long enough to pry open the world. I stood up and went to the back door. The moon hung thin like a fingernail. I put my hand to the wood, the simple painted surface that had been a witness to so many small things. Children's laughter, whispered vows, and the quiet hours of survival. The letter trembled in my pocket. I felt small and older and whetted like a blade, ready to be used. "He's moving him," I whispered to the house, and it felt both like fact and a dare. Not if I can help it. I did not sleep that night. I rose when the house was still a hush and my hands folded the herbs and wrapped them with the same careful fingers that had wrapped the notebooks. I packed a different bag this time. No quilt, no legal papers in sight. Just the small things that made a woman in the wild. A tin of salve, candles, a coil of rope, a jar of dried mint. I held the letter to my chest and felt the nervous beating like a bird. There are plans within plans, I thought. The law is a long, bright thing. But sometimes the bright thing needs shadow to be seen. I walked to the window and watched the road. Dawn bled over the pines. In the distance, headlights like slow hyenas cut the dark and came closer, then receded again. Some farmer moving his truck down the highway. My heart was loud in my ears. And then from the west, where the private road met the main gravel lane, a pair of headlights appeared and did not slow. They moved with a directness that felt like someone who knew where they were going. The shape of the truck told me nothing at first. The sound told me more. Not Everett's thin, impatient engine, but a larger vehicle, one that carried a weight. Owen woke and came to the window. He did not speak. His face was the same face that had once whispered, "What we're doing is wrong." And now in the quiet morning, he watched the road like a boy who has learned to read the sky. The truck's headlights grew brighter and brighter, swallowing the thin morning. It was heading straight for the gate. I felt the old clock inside me, years of watching, measuring, begin to tick faster. All at once the careful logic of our plan and the unknown needs of what might come met each other like two horses at a crossing. I did not know who was in that truck. I did not know whether it was a man bringing news or a man bringing chains. I only knew I had to move. The instruments of patience I had polished for years suddenly felt like tools for a different kind of work. I slid on my boots and took the letter from my pocket. "When they come," I told Owen without turning, "we will either speak with the law or we will become law ourselves. But we will not let him disappear." He nodded. His hands were small, but they closed around mine like a promise. The truck slowed at the gate. The engine idled. A figure stepped out into the thin light, and for a moment the world held its breath with us. Then a voice called out, plain and steady, "Mrs. Gunderson? Edith? It's Sheriff Malone. Got a minute?" I closed my fingers around Owen's hand until I tasted metal. I had hoped for officers, for fairness, for slow justice. I had not hoped for surprise. I had not hoped for whatever this morning would turn into. Behind us, the house held a dozen ghosts. Ahead, a man in a sheriff's hat waited under the silver sky. Between them, my life hung like a weight on the scale of a very old clock. If I had learned anything in the years Everett thought he owned me, it was this: you cannot predict everything. But you can choose the first step you take when the unknown comes. I opened the door. The cat brush of the kitchen floor met my foot. Outside, the sheriff's face was lined and worn by too many winters. He looked at me the way you look at a ledger and realize a line is missing. "May I come in?" he asked. I stepped out onto the porch and felt the morning as if it were a thing that could be tasted. Behind the sheriff, the truck's shadow stretched like a question. "Come on in," I said, and my voice sounded like iron warmed and shaped for something that had to be done. We had the notebooks. We had the law thinking about him. But the world I now knew was a shifting place. And as the sheriff crossed the yard, his boots soft on the grass, I felt the old thrum of resolve in my chest. Something else had entered our little story, and it could change everything. Sheriff Malone stood in my kitchen like a man trying to fit his boots into a church pew, polite but uneasy, as if the air itself was too fragile to breathe. The morning light sliced through the curtains, turning the dust into gold. I poured him coffee because that's what women like me do when life tilts sideways. We hold on to small rituals so our hands have something to do besides tremble. He thanked me, eyes lowered, hat twisting between his fingers. "Ma'am," he said finally, "I won't take much of your time. But there's been a development concerning your husband." The word husband felt like an insult, like a stain that never came out no matter how much soap you used. I didn't answer. I waited. Malone cleared his throat, the way people do before they bring trouble. "He's been transferred to the state psychiatric unit over in Missoula. The order came down late last night." I blinked. Transferred? Under whose authority? "That's the thing," Malone said, eyes darting toward the window. "Came straight from Helena. State-level clearance. Said he's to be evaluated under Section 17C of the Mental Health Code. Something about preserving his research material." He hesitated on those words like they were sharp. "They didn't give me the full file. The air left my lungs in a quiet, controlled hiss. Research material. That phrase had haunted my nightmares for decades. To them, he was still a scientist. A man of potential. To me, he was wrought in a human shape. Malone must have seen the shift in my face. He leaned forward, lowering his voice. Look, Mrs. Gunderson, between you and me, I don't like it either. But I don't make the calls above my badge. The order's sealed. I just thought you ought to know. I nodded slowly. The kind of nod that tells a man you understand him but not the world he represents. Thank you, Sheriff. He finished his coffee, apologized again for the intrusion, and left with a soft clink of his spurs on the wooden steps. I watched the truck disappear down the gravel road, its tires kicking up a cloud that shimmered in the sunlight like ghosts rising. When the sound faded, I sat back down at the kitchen table. My hands were steady now. I could feel the thrum of my pulse, slow and deliberate, like a clock I'd wound myself. Transferred. Research material. Protected. They were going to hide him. Not punish him. Not expose him. Preserve him. The law, it seemed, was not as stubborn as I had hoped. Owen came in then, sleepy-eyed but alert, sensing the air had changed. What did he say? I looked at my boy. No longer a boy really, but a young man shaped by too many shadows. They moved him, I said quietly. To Missoula. Owen frowned. Isn't that a hospital? Yes, I said, and my voice felt like the edge of a blade. A hospital for men who pretend madness when they can't face their own evil. He sat down across from me, elbows on the table, hands folded like prayer. What does that mean for us? It means, I said, that the world hasn't finished its experiment yet, but we're going to write the conclusion ourselves. The next few weeks passed in a blur of faces, letters, and closed doors. The lawyer who once sounded like a hymn now spoke with caution. The state wants to review his mental competence, he explained over the phone. If he's declared unfit, he'll avoid prison. They'll say he needs treatment instead of punishment. Treatment. As if madness could explain whatever it did. As if there was a medicine for cruelty. I didn't argue. Not with words. Words were slow weapons. I preferred sharper ones. That night, after the children went to bed, I took the letter from Helena, the one about the transfer, and laid it on the table. I read it under the soft light of the oil lamp until I could see not just the words but the gaps between them, the way a trapper studies tracks in the snow. They mentioned the Missoula unit, a doctor's name I recognized from Everett's university days, and a clause about ongoing research preservation. That was enough. He wasn't just being hidden. He was being reclaimed. Someone wanted his notes, his methods. The monster had found disciples. I folded the letter and slid it into the pocket of my cardigan. Then I went out to the garden. The moon was half full, pale and patient. My herbs swayed in the cool air like a congregation. I knelt in the dirt and brushed my fingers through the leaves. Lavender, mint, valerian, foxglove. My mother's lessons whispered through my mind. Each plant holds a purpose. Each purpose holds a choice. I made mine. The next morning, I visited Mrs. Hall at the post office again. She looked at me over her spectacles, saw something in my face, and didn't ask too many questions. I mailed a letter addressed to the Missoula facility, official-looking, written in the same dry bureaucratic tone as their own forms. It requested a visitor's appointment for Edith Maxwell, spouse of patient. I even forged a small signature at the bottom, one I'd practiced enough to look convincingly like the state clerk's. If Everett was being preserved like a specimen, then I intended to see him in his glass jar. The approval came faster than I expected. A neat envelope with an appointment time, a polite warning about restricted access, and a note that patients undergoing intensive observation may present with erratic behavior. I laughed when I read that line. Erratic behavior. As if that was new. The drive to Missoula took 5 hours. I packed a small basket. Bread, apples, a jar of chamomile honey, and a flask of herbal tea I'd brewed the night before. A simple offering, the kind no nurse would question. The herbs inside were mild enough to seem harmless, yet precise enough to unsettle the body after a few hours. Sweats, dizziness, confusion. Nothing fatal. Just enough to remind a man of mortality. When I arrived, the facility looked nothing like a hospital. It looked like a prison dressed up for Sunday service. High white walls, narrow windows, guards who smiled without warmth. The receptionist asked for my ID. I handed it over with a trembling hand that wasn't trembling at all. She directed me to a waiting room with gray chairs and a ticking clock that sounded too loud for the silence. When they finally brought him in, I almost didn't recognize him. Everett Maxwell had aged, yes, but not like normal men do. His hair was thinner, his skin sallow, but his eyes, those cold, calculating eyes, were still the same. Behind the glass of the visitation room, he looked at me with something like curiosity. "Well," he said softly through the phone receiver, "if it isn't my most successful subject." I smiled. "And here I thought you'd forgotten me." He chuckled low and hoarse. "Oh, Edith. You were unforgettable. I documented everything, remember? Every phase of your transformation. How's the resilience holding up?" "You tell me," I said. "I'm still standing." He tilted his head, studying me like the old days. "You came to gloat?" "No," I said. "I came to deliver your results." He blinked just once, but I saw it, the small fracture in his composure. "Results?" "Yes," I said, holding up the thermos. "The experiment, Everett. The one you started decades ago. It's over now. I just thought you'd want to taste the ending." He smiled slowly, mockingly. "Still dramatic, aren't you? What's in it? Poison? Revenge?" "Closure," I said simply. "And a little chamomile." He laughed, shaking his head. "You always had a flair for theater. Tell me, do you really think you've won?" "I don't think," I said, rising from my chair. "I know. The guard signal that time was up." Everett leaned forward against the glass. "You can't erase me," he hissed. "They'll continue my work. Others already have." I placed my hand on the glass opposite his. "Then let this be my contribution to science," I whispered. "A demonstration in cause and effect." And I walked away. I didn't stay to watch him drink the tea. I didn't need to. The call came that evening while I was back in Pinewood, sitting on the porch with Owen watching the creek. The voice on the phone was official and trembling. They said he'd fallen unconscious during routine observation. Severe reaction. No sign of foul play. The body is being transferred for autopsy, they said. I thanked them politely, hung up, and stared at the horizon until the stars came out. Owen looked at me. "What happened?" I turned to him with a calm that wasn't calm at all. "Science," I said softly. "It finally reached its conclusion." He didn't ask for more. He just sat beside me, silent, the creek whispering like a witness. But peace doesn't arrive on command. It comes in fragments. Weeks later, I stood in my garden again, the same herbs rustling around me. The town thought of me as the widow of a deranged man, a victim who survived. Maybe they were right. Maybe they weren't. Sometimes late at night I dream of that glass room, of Everett's eyes widening as realization bloomed. Sometimes I wake up to the sound of my cats playing in the kitchen, and for a second I think I hear him scribbling notes, muttering about data and resilience. But then the dawn comes, and I make tea, the kind that heals, not harms, because justice isn't about revenge. It's about balance. And I've finally restored mine. Still, as I pour water over the herbs, I whisper to the soil, to the ghosts, to the universe itself. No one, no scientist, no God, no man, messes with a mother and gets away with it. The wind carries the scent of chamomile through the garden. The cats stretch lazily in the sun. Somewhere far away another file closes forever. And in that silence, for the first time in decades, I feel free. They buried him quietly. No family, no ceremony, no priest. The death notice was short, clinical, the way a coroner might write about a lab rat. Everett H. Maxwell, age 79, deceased due to acute cardiac failure during observation. That was it. No mention of what he'd done. No mention of the bodies he left walking. I read the line in the local paper 3 times, then folded it neatly and tucked it into my journal between dried lavender and a photograph of my children when they were still small enough to believe the world was safe. But peace isn't a straight line, it's a spiral. You circle it over and over, sometimes closer, sometimes farther. I thought his death would close the loop. Instead, it opened new cracks I didn't know existed. Because when the devil dies, his echo lingers. 2 weeks after his death, a letter arrived from Missoula. Thick paper, government seal, my name typed too neatly on the front. I stared at it over my morning tea before finally tearing it open. Mrs. Edith Maxwell Gunderson, we are writing to inform you that certain research materials belonging to your late husband remain under state custody. Due to the sensitive nature of these materials, you are requested to appear at the Missoula facility to discuss the proper disposition of the items. I almost laughed. Disposition of items. They meant the black notebooks, the record of my years in hell. They weren't going to destroy them. They wanted to preserve them. Again, I felt my hand start to tremble, but I forced it still. The old anger wanted to rise, to burn. Instead, I took a breath, slow and deep. This was no time for rage. This required precision. That night I called Owen. He had moved to Bozeman with his wife and their baby girl, trying to build a life that didn't carry his father's shadow. "Mom," he said, his voice soft with the same gentleness he used when he spoke to his daughter. "You can't keep reliving this." "I'm not reliving it," I told him. "I'm making sure no one else lives it again." He sighed, the sound of someone who has seen too much. "What are you planning?" "Something tidy," I said. "Something final." The drive to Missoula felt longer this time, though the distance hadn't changed. Maybe it was the way the mountains seemed to watch me, their white caps gleaming like they remembered. The facility had been partly shut down after Everett's death, though they said a small team was still cataloging his work. The receptionist recognized me, her eyes flickering with curiosity before settling into polite professionalism. "We're so sorry for your loss, Mrs. Maxwell." I smiled thinly. "Don't be. It wasn't yours." They led me to a storage room in the lower wing. The air smelled of disinfectant and cold paper. There, stacked in metal shelves, were the black notebooks. Dozens of them. My life in ink. The young attendant who stood beside me, a woman in her 20s with nervous hands, cleared her throat. "They said you could decide whether you wanted these transferred to an academic archive or destroyed under supervision." I turned to her. "Destroyed," I said. "All of them." She blinked. "Are you sure? Some of this might have historical significance." I looked at her, really looked at her. The innocence, the curiosity, the same spark I'd once had before someone turned it into kindling for cruelty. "Child," I said quietly, "there's nothing of history in those pages. Only suffering." She hesitated, then nodded. "I'll arrange the paperwork." As she walked out, I let my fingers brush over the nearest notebook. The leather was cracked and worn like the skin of something long dead. I opened it, just one page, and there it was, his handwriting neat as a metronome. Subject A displayed heightened resistance when stimuli applied by Subject B, age 7. Hypothesis confirmed. Maternal bond increases threshold before collapse. I closed the book gently as if tucking in a corpse. No more notes. No more observations. No more experiments. I signed the papers authorizing destruction. But before they could act, I made one request. "I'd like to do it myself," I told them. "It's personal." They hesitated but agreed. Maybe they thought it was symbolic, cathartic, one of those things grief-stricken widows do for closure. If only they knew. That evening, as dusk fell over Missoula, I stood in the facility's small incineration yard. The mountain wind bit at my cheeks. The sky was the color of old bruises. The attendant handed me gloves and a long match. The stack of notebooks sat before me, neatly piled in a metal bin. I struck the match. The flame flared, small but steady. I watched it catch the edge of the first notebook. The fire spread slowly, as if reluctant to consume something so vile. The smell came next. Burnt leather, paper, and something else underneath. Memory. I stood there until the last page turned to ash. When it was done, I pressed my hand to my chest. For a moment, I felt nothing but the wind. Then slowly I began to feel lighter. I thought that would be the end. But as I turned to leave, I noticed one of the facility guards standing nearby, watching me too closely. "Something wrong?" I asked. He smiled faintly. "Just making sure it's all handled properly, ma'am." But his eyes betrayed him. They weren't watching the fire, they were watching me. And that was when I knew. The state wasn't just preserving Everett's work. They were recruiting. Back home I couldn't sleep. The fire's glow still burned behind my eyes. I dreamed of the guard's face, his expression calm and clinical like Everett's. The next morning I went into town. I stopped by the library, then the county records office. I asked small questions in a small voice about the Missoula facility, about government programs, about research transfers. People talk when you sound like a harmless old lady. By afternoon I had names. 3 of them. Former colleagues of Everett's who had written papers on experimental trauma modeling and behavioral resilience studies. They were still active. 1 in Colorado. 1 in Oregon. 1 here in Montana. Everett's ghost was alive, and it had disciples. I sat on the bench outside the courthouse and looked up at the mountains. The clouds rolled in like heavy gray curtains. Not again, I whispered. Because once you've lived inside the experiment, you can always smell when another one's about to begin. That night, as rain began to fall, I walked out to the garden. My herbs shimmered under the drops, bending but not breaking. I dug my fingers into the wet soil, feeling the pulse of the earth beneath it. My mother used to say that plants remember kindness. I wonder if they remember vengeance too. I wasn't the kind of woman who believed in destiny, but I believed in continuation. In cause and effect. Everett thought he could turn suffering into science. I would turn science into justice. And justice, as I'd learned, sometimes grows from the same ground as poison. I gathered the herbs I needed: belladonna, foxglove, datura, aconite. Plants that can heal or harm depending on the dose, depending on the hand. I laid them on the table inside, next to a fresh notebook. Not black this time, but plain brown, bound in twine. I wrote on the first page, Project Redemption. Phase 1, Observation. Because sometimes to end a story you have to start a new experiment. One where I was the scientist. One where I would study the men who thought they could build pain into progress. And unlike Everett, I would not lose control of my subject. I would be patient, careful, methodical. After all, he had taught me well. Outside, thunder rolled across the Montana sky. My cats prowled restlessly at the door, their eyes reflecting the lightning. I closed the notebook, blew out the lamp, and whispered to the storm. Class is in session. You can't rush revenge, not if you want it to matter. Everett taught me that without meaning to. He believed the best experiments took time. Controlled conditions, precise variables, patience measured in suffering. I spent 15 years learning that patience under his hand. Now I would spend the rest of my life using it against him, and every man who carried his name in footnotes in academic journals. After I burned the notebooks, the world thought I was done. That's how they see women like me. Fragile, folded things who should sit quietly and heal. They didn't notice that I never stopped writing. First, my new journal was just observations. Lists of names, dates, conference schedules, grants issued to behavioral resilience research. I mapped connections like a spider weaving silk. I found that Everett's work had seeped into places far beyond Montana. Universities, think tanks, even private clinics claiming to help trauma victims retrain their neural responses. All using phrases lifted directly from his pages. I didn't need proof that his ideas lived on. I needed proximity. And so, in the fall of 1981, I went to Helena pretending to be what everyone already thought I was. An old widow looking for purpose. There was a wellness center there. The Dawson Institute for Adaptive Psychology. A place that promised revolutionary treatments for emotional recovery. One of the founders was Dr. Leonard Sykes, a man who had co-authored 2 papers with Everett in the 1960s. I recognized his name the way you recognize the shadow of something you used to fear. I walked into the front office wearing a pale blue dress and carrying a tin of chamomile cookies. I'd like to volunteer, I told the young receptionist. I know herbs. I can help the patients relax. She smiled, that easy, patronizing smile people reserve for harmless old ladies. Within a week, I was working part-time in the gardens behind the institute, tending their plants and preparing herbal teas for mind-calming therapy. They had no idea who they'd hired. Dr. Sykes looked nothing like the brilliant monster I'd built up in my mind. He was soft, gray-haired, with a face that had surrendered to comfort long ago. But the way he spoke to his patients made my stomach tighten. That same detached curiosity I'd heard in Everett's voice when he told Owen to hurt me for science. I saw him through the window sometimes, sitting with a patient, a woman shaking, confused, and writing notes while she cried. Observe without attachment, he used to say to his interns. Empathy is the contamination of data. I began to take notes of my own. Not in secret but carefully disguised in plain sight. Written between recipes for teas and tinctures, the margins filled with botanical sketches. But each drawing had a name beside it. A staff member, a date, a phrase overheard. In my notebook, the rosemary leaves hid the truth. Test subject 14 exhibited dissociation after repeated memory immersion. Under sketches of lavender, Dr. Sykes' repeated phrase, pain tolerance plateau. Under foxglove, soundproof room, basement level, access by keycard only. You see, cruelty always builds itself a hiding place. But I'd learned how to dig. 2 months in, I found the basement door. It looked harmless, just another therapy room. But I recognized the hum of electrical equipment behind the walls. The faint scent of disinfectant and fear. One night after everyone left, I lingered. I had borrowed a keycard from the laundry supervisor, claiming I'd misplaced mine. The system was simple, outdated. I swiped the card. The light turned green. Inside, the air was cold. There were 3 rooms, each one small and clean in that way only horror can be. Spotless, ordered, cruel. Machines with sensors. A camera mounted above a chair with restraints on the arms. I touched the chair and felt every nerve in my body remember. On the table, a file lay open. I didn't mean to look, but of course I did. The first line stopped my heart. Experiment 7, Subject C1. Induced maternal guilt as a recovery accelerant. They were using mothers again. Women who'd lost children, manipulating their grief in the name of therapy. Everett's work reborn, dressed up in new language. I closed the file slowly, fighting the urge to tear it apart. Not yet. Not until I had everything. For weeks I played the part. The smiling volunteer with steady hands and kind eyes. I brought tea to the doctors, and they never questioned the ingredients. Most herbs calm the mind. A few used sparingly make the mind more talkative. Within days, I knew which doctor had access to which files, who unlocked which doors, who took bribes from which pharmaceutical companies. Sykes liked to talk after his 3rd cup. He'd lean back, loosening his tie, and tell me how misunderstood his work was. The world doesn't see the beauty in controlled suffering, he once said. They forget that resilience requires resistance. Like a plant, I replied softly, handing him another cup. The more wind, the stronger the stem. He smiled. Exactly. Oh, he loved that metaphor. So I let him keep it, right up until the night the wind finally broke him. It was January when the snow came heavy, muffling everything in white. The institute shut early. I stayed behind, claiming I needed to cover the greenhouse to keep the frost off the basil. Sykes was in his office, packing for a trip to a conference in Denver. He'd left his door slightly open. I watched him through the gap, his coat on the chair, his briefcase filled with folders labeled Adaptive Resilience Trial. When he went to the restroom, I stepped inside. I replaced 2 of the folders with exact replicas I'd made. Copies filled not with his data, but with my own version of it. Altered graphs, missing signatures, contradictory results. A few photographs, 2 edited images suggesting falsified trials, unethical methods. Evidence of fraud. By the time he returned, the seed was planted. A week later, I mailed anonymous packets to the state board, the local paper, and one very ambitious journalist in Helena. It didn't take long. When the story broke, it hit like a wildfire. Dawson Institute under investigation for unethical practices. Sykes resigned within days. They called it procedural discrepancies. But I knew better. The basement was sealed. The institute shut down. Nobody looked for the old volunteer who'd simply stopped showing up after the snow melted. I returned home to my garden, to my cats, to the quiet creek. I spent my mornings baking pies and my nights writing in the brown notebook. Phase 1 complete. But the work wasn't over. 2 more names remained on my list. Everett's other collaborators. One in Oregon, one in Colorado. Owen didn't know about this part. I didn't tell him. He'd done enough surviving. This was mine to finish. Sometimes when the nights are long and the wind howls through the pines, I still hear Everett's voice, calm and precise. You can't control what you can't measure, Edith. He was right about that. Which is why I measure everything. My breath, my steps. The strength of the tea I brew when a man sits across from me and tells me how progress must sometimes hurt. The world is full of Everetts. They just wear better suits now. But I've learned something they never will. Pain teaches better than power. and I am an excellent teacher. A few weeks ago, I received a letter from Oregon, a research symposium invitation addressed to Mrs. Edith Maxwell, noted contributor in herbal therapy for trauma recovery. I smiled as I read it, an invitation from the same circle that once turned me into data. So I packed my bag. Inside, a jar of dried foxglove, a sprig of wolfsbane, and a small envelope of powdered valerian, harmless in small doses, paralyzing in excess. Some people attend conferences to share knowledge. I attend to finish the lesson. The cat brushed against my leg as I closed the door behind me. The wind caught the chime above the porch, its sound clear and sharp in the cold morning air. I whispered into it, almost lovingly. Phase 2 begins. The symposium in Oregon was held in an old converted hotel, the kind that tried to look modern but still smelled faintly of dust and carpet cleaner. Scientists, therapists, and psychologists filled the halls, wearing polite smiles that didn't reach their eyes. They carried notebooks, tablets, and cups of burnt coffee, tools of progress, they said. Tools of control, I thought. I checked in under my full name, Edith May Maxwell. I hadn't used it in decades. Seeing it on the badge made my hands go cold, but I smiled. Sometimes you have to wear the ghost to make the living notice. Inside the conference hall, I spotted him almost immediately. Dr. William Crane, age 63, co-author of Behavioral Adaptation Through Familial Stress. Everett's former assistant. He looked older, softer around the edges, but the eyes, those clinical, indifferent eyes, hadn't changed. They were Everett's eyes in another skull. I listened quietly as he gave his talk. We must not confuse discomfort with damage, he said, pacing the stage. Through carefully controlled emotional stimuli, the subject can achieve greater resilience. The audience nodded, scribbling notes. I felt bile rise in my throat. When he finished, they clapped. I did too, smiling, clapping just loud enough to be noticed. Later that evening, there was a reception in the hotel lounge. Wine, soft music, polite laughter. I approached the bar and ordered 2 glasses of red. My hand didn't shake. Crane was standing by the window, talking to a younger researcher, basking in admiration. When the young man left, I stepped forward. Dr. Crane, I said warmly. You don't remember me, do you? He squinted, polite confusion. I'm afraid I don't, Mrs. Maxwell. The name hit him like a brick. His eyes widened a fraction before his expression rearranged itself into a diplomatic smile. Ah, of course. Everett's wife. Widow, I corrected. He cleared his throat. I'm sorry for your loss. He was brilliant. I interrupted softly. A pioneer? He hesitated. I was going to say complicated. I handed him the second glass of wine. To complicated men, I said. And to the women who survived them. He laughed awkwardly, raised the glass, and drank. I sipped mine. The music hummed through the room. A piano playing something slow. Something that sounded like forgiveness if you didn't know better. We talked. I told him lies wrapped in truth. That I'd spent years studying herbs. That I wanted to understand my husband's legacy. That I believed in healing through controlled hardship. He was intrigued. Men like him always are when a woman seems to admire their cruelty disguised as intellect. I'd love to show you my work, he said, lowering his voice. We're doing some fascinating studies at my clinic in Portland. Privately funded, of course. I'd like that, I said, smiling. 3 weeks later, I arrived at his clinic on the outskirts of Portland. The building was sleek and sterile, a box of glass and steel rising from the forest like a promise. Crane greeted me with that same smooth professionalism. We don't usually allow outsiders, he said. But you're practically part of the history of this field. History, I thought. That's what they call what they can't wash off. He led me through the facility. Behind locked doors, I saw things that twisted my stomach: soundproof rooms, EEG machines, observation booths. They called it therapy. I called it resurrection. When he wasn't looking, I slipped into the storage wing. Inside were shelves of labeled vials and folders, each marked with codes and patient initials. I opened one file. Subject L9 Grief Resistance Training. Subject reports recurring dreams of deceased child. Emotional threshold increased after induced guilt simulation. It was the same script, the same poison Everett had written decades ago. Different man, same rot. That night, Crane invited me to dinner in his office. To celebrate collaboration, he said. I brought tea. He poured wine. He talked about theories about breakthroughs about how pain was the currency of evolution. His words floated like ash in the candlelight. I nodded, patient, listening the way I used to listen to Everett, long enough to learn where the weakness lived. When the moment felt right, I poured him a cup. A blend from my garden, I said. For clarity. He lifted the cup, inhaled and smiled. Ah, chamomile? Among other things. He drank. Twice. We kept talking. His words slowed. His pupils widened. The color drained from his face. What did you? Don't worry, I said softly. It's not fatal. Just enlightening. He tried to stand but couldn't. His breath quickened, his hands trembling. The body has its own truth when it realizes it's been betrayed. I leaned close, my voice steady, almost tender. You studied suffering, didn't you? You thought you could measure it, replicate it, own it. Tell me, Dr. Crane, how resilient do you feel right now? He tried to speak, but only a sound came out, a dry, broken rasp. I took his trembling hand and placed it over his chest. You're not dying, I whispered. You're remembering. And then I left him there, sweating, shaking, alive. Because real punishment isn't death. It's understanding. By dawn I was gone. The news came 2 days later. Prominent psychologist hospitalized after apparent nervous breakdown. No foul play suspected. They said he began rambling about voices from the past, and experiments turned inside out. The clinic shut down within a month. I returned to Montana one last time. The creek was still there, whispering through the stones. My garden was wild now, herbs gone to seed, lavender bending heavy with bloom. My cats slept in the sun like small lions guarding Eden. Owen visited that Sunday with his daughter. He looked at me across the porch, his eyes soft but searching. It's really over now, isn't it? I smiled. Almost. He frowned. Mom, what does that mean? I reached out, brushing a speck of flour from his sleeve. It means the story's finished. The rest is just gardening. He didn't ask again. After they left, I went to the back of the house. The last notebook, the brown one, lay on my table. I opened it to the final page. Phase 3, conclusion. I wrote, evil doesn't die. Decomposes. And from its rot, something new can grow, if you plant carefully. I tore the page out, walked to the garden, and buried it beneath the lavender. The soil was soft, warm against my palms. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of earth and sweetness. Somewhere a hawk cried above the pines, sharp, free, alive. I stood there for a long time, breathing. Then I turned toward the house, toward the quiet, toward the life I'd remade from ashes. Before I went inside, I whispered one last thing to the wind, to Everett, to every man who ever thought a woman's pain could be quantified. Experiment concluded. And this time it truly was.